Animism is the worldview that non-human entities, such as animals, plants, and inanimate objects, possess a spiritual essence. Animism is used in the anthropology of religion as a term for the belief system of some indigenous tribal peoples, especially prior to the development of organized religion. Although each culture has its own different mythologies and rituals, animism is said to describe the most common, foundational thread of indigenous peoples' spiritual, or supernatural, perspectives. The animistic perspective is so fundamental, mundane, everyday, and taken for granted that most animistic indigenous people do not even have a word in their languages that corresponds to animism. The term is an anthropological construct, largely due to such ethno-linguistic and cultural discrepancies. Opinion has differed on whether animism refers to a broad religious belief or to a full-fledged religion in its own right. The currently accepted definition of animism was only developed in the late 19th century by Sir Edward Tylor, who created it as one of anthropology's earliest concepts, if not the first. Animism encompasses the beliefs that there is no separation between the spiritual and physical world, and that souls or spirits exist, not only in humans, but also in some other animals, plants, rocks, geographic features such as mountains or rivers, or other entities of the natural environment, including thunder, wind, and shadows. Animism thus rejects Cartesian dualism. Animism may further attribute souls to abstract concepts such as words, true names, or metaphors in mythology. Some members of the non-tribal world also consider themselves animists. Theories of animism. Old animism. Earlier anthropological perspectives, since termed the Old Animism, were concerned with knowledge surrounding what is alive and what factors make something alive. The Old Animism assumed that animists were individuals who were unable to understand the difference between persons and things. Critics of the Old Animism have accused it of preserving colonialist and dualist worldviews and rhetoric. Edward Tylor's definition. The idea of animism was developed by the anthropologist Sir Edward Tylor in his 1871 book Primitive Culture, in which he defined it as the general doctrine of souls and other spiritual beings in general. According to Tylor, animism often includes an idea of pervading life and will in nature, i.e., a belief that natural objects other than humans have souls. This formulation was little different from that proposed by Auguste Comte's fetishism, although the terms now have distinct uses. For Tylor, animism represented the earliest form of religion, being situated within an evolutionary framework of religion which has developed in stages and which will ultimately lead to humanity rejecting religion altogether in favor of scientific rationality. Thus, for Tylor, animism was fundamentally seen as a mistake, a basic error from which all religion grew. He did not believe that animism was inherently illogical, but suggested that it arose from early humans' dreams and visions, and thus while being a rational system, it was based on erroneous, unscientific observations about the nature of reality. Stringer notes that his reading of Primitive Culture led him to believe that Tylor was far more sympathetic in regard to primitive populations than many of his contemporaries, and that Tylor expressed no belief that there was any difference between the intellectual capabilities of savage people and Westerners. Taylor had initially wanted to describe this phenomenon as spiritualism, however he decided against this upon recognizing that it would cause confusion with the modern religion of spiritualism which was prevalent across Western nations during his own time. He adopted the term animism from the writings of the German scientist Georg Ernst Stahl, who, in 1708, had developed the term animismus as a biological theory that souls formed the vital principle and that the normal phenomena of life and the abnormal phenomena of disease could be traced to spiritual causes. The earliest known usage in English appeared in 1819. The idea that there had once been one universal form of primitive religion, whether labeled animism, totemism, or shamanism, has been dismissed as unsophisticated and erroneous by the archaeologist Timothy Insole, who stated that it removes complexity, a precondition of religion now, in all its variants. Social evolutionist conceptions. Tyler's definition of animism was a part of a growing international debate on the nature of primitive society by lawyers, theologians, and philologists. The debate defined the field of research of a new science, anthropology. By the end of the 19th century, an orthodoxy on primitive society had emerged. Although few anthropologists today would accept their definition, the 19th-century armchair anthropologists argued primitive society was ordered by kinship and was divided into exogamous descent groups related by a series of marriage exchanges. Their religion was animism, the belief that natural species and objects had souls. With the development of private property, these descent groups were displaced by the emergence of the territorial state. These rituals and beliefs eventually evolved over time into the vast array of developed religions. According to Tyler, the more scientifically advanced a society became, the fewer members of that society believed in animism. However, any remnant ideologies of souls or spirits, to Tyler, represented survivals of the original animism of early humanity. The term animism clearly began as an expression of a nest of insulting approaches to indigenous peoples and the earliest putatively religious humans. It was, and sometimes remains, a colonialist slur. Graham Harvey, 2005. In 1869, the Edinburgh lawyer, John Ferguson McClellan, argued that the animistic thinking evident in fetishism gave rise to a religion he named Totemism. Primitive people believed, he argued, that they were descended of the same species as their totemic animal. Subsequent debate by the armchair anthropologists remained focused on totemism rather than animism, with few directly challenging Tyler's definition. Indeed, anthropologists have commonly avoided the issue of animism and even the term itself rather than revisit this prevalent notion in light of their new and richer ethnographies. According to the anthropologist Tim Ingold, animism shares similarities to totemism but differs in its focus on individual spirit beings which help to perpetuate life, whereas totemism more typically holds that there is a primary source, such as the land itself or the ancestors, who provide the basis to life. Certain indigenous religious groups such as the Australian Aboriginals are more typically totemic, whereas others like the Inuit are more typically animistic in their worldview. From his studies into child development, Jean Piaget suggested that children were born with an innate animist worldview in which they anthropomorphized inanimate objects, and that it was only later that they grew out of this belief. Conversely, from her ethnographic research, Margaret Mead argued the opposite, believing that children were not born with an animist worldview but that they became acculturated to such beliefs as they were educated by their society. Stuart Guthrie saw animism, or attribution, as he preferred it, as an evolutionary strategy to aid survival. He argued that both humans and other animal species view inanimate objects as potentially alive as a means of being constantly on guard against potential threats. His suggested explanation, however, did not deal with the question of why such a belief became central to religion. In 2000, Guthrie suggested that the most widespread concept of animism was that it was the attribution of spirits to natural phenomena, such as stones and trees. New animism. Many anthropologists cease using the term animism, deeming it to be too close to early anthropological theory and religious polemic. However, the term had also been claimed by religious groups, namely indigenous communities and nature worshippers, who felt that it aptly described their own beliefs, and who in some cases actively identified as animists. It was thus readopted by various scholars, however they began using the term in a different way. placing the focus on knowing how to behave toward other persons, some of whom aren't human. As the religious studies scholar Graham Harvey stated, while the old animist definition had been problematic, the term animism was nevertheless of considerable value as a critical, academic term for a style of religious and cultural relating to the world. The new animism emerged largely from the publications of the anthropologist Irving Hallowell, which were produced on the basis of his ethnographic research among the Ojibwa communities of Canada in the mid-20th century. For the Ojibwa encountered by Hallowell, personhood did not require human likeness, but rather humans were perceived as being like other persons, who for instance included rock persons and bear persons. For the Ojibwa, these persons were each willful beings who gained meaning and power through their interactions with others. Through respectfully interacting with other persons, they themselves learned to act as a person. Hallowell's approach to the understanding of Ojibwa personhood differed strongly from prior anthropological concepts of animism. He emphasized the need to challenge the modernist, Western perspectives of what a person is by entering into a dialogue with different worldviews. Hallowell's approach influenced the work of anthropologist Rdavout, who produced a scholarly article reassessing the idea of animism in 1999. 7 comments from other academics were provided in the journal, debating Davis's ideas. After a lengthy period of disinterest, postmodern anthropologists are increasingly engaging with the concept of animism. Modernism is characterized by a Cartesian subject-object dualism that divides the subjective from the objective, and cultural from nature. In this view, animism is the inverse of scientism, and hence inherently invalid. Drawing on the work of Bruno Latour, these anthropologists question these modernist assumptions, and theorize that all societies continue to animate the world around them, and not just as a Taylorian survival of primitive thought. Rather, the instrumental reason characteristic of modernity is limited to our professional subcultures, which allows us to treat the world as a detached, mechanical object in a delimited sphere of activity. We, like animists, also continue to create personal relationships with elements of the so-called objective world, whether pets, cars or teddy bears, who we recognize as subjects. As such, these entities are approached as communicative subjects rather than the inert objects perceived by modernists. These approaches are careful to avoid the modernist assumptions that the environment consists dichotomously of a physical world distinct from humans, and from modernist conceptions of the person as composed dualistically as body and soul. Rdavout argues that positivistic ideas about the meaning of nature, life, and personhood misdirected these previous attempts to understand the local concepts. Classical theoreticians attributed their own modernist ideas of self to primitive peoples while asserting that the primitive peoples read their idea of self into others. She argues that animism is a relational epistemology, and not a Taylorian failure of primitive reasoning. That is, self-identity among animists is based on their relationships with others, rather than some distinctive feature of the self. Instead of focusing on the essentialized modernist self, persons are viewed as bundles of social relationships, some of which are with superpersons. Tim Ingold, like Rdavout, argues that animists do not see themselves as separate from their environment. Hunter-gatherers do not, as a rule, approach their environment as an external world of nature that has to be grasped intellectually. Indeed, the separation of mind and nature has no place in their thought and practice. Willerslev extends the argument by noting that animists reject this Cartesian dualism, and that the animist self-identifies with the world, feeling at once within and apart from it, so that the two glide ceaselessly in and out of each other in a sealed circuit. The animist hunter is thus aware of himself as a human hunter, but through mimicry is able to assume the viewpoint, senses, and sensibilities of his prey, to be one with it. Shamanism, in this view, is an everyday attempt to influence spirits of ancestors and animals by mirroring their behaviors as the hunter does his prey. The religious studies scholar Graham Harvey defined animism as the belief that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life is always lived in relationship with others. He added that it is therefore concerned with learning how to be a good person in respectful relationships with other persons. Graham Harvey, in his 2013 Handbook of Contemporary Animism, identifies the animist perspective in line with Martin Buber's I-thou, as opposed to I-it. In such, Harvey says, the animist takes an I-thou approach to relating to his world, where objects and animals are treated as of thou, rather than as an it. Guthrie expressed criticism of Bird David's attitude toward animism, believing that it promulgated the view that the world is in large measure whatever our local imagination makes it. This, he felt, would result in anthropology abandoning the scientific project. Religion. There is ongoing disagreement as to whether animism is merely a singular, broadly encompassing religious belief or a worldview in and of itself, comprising many diverse mythologies found worldwide in many diverse cultures. This also raises a controversy regarding the ethical claims animism may or may not make, whether animism ignores questions of ethics altogether or, by endowing various non-human elements of nature with spirituality or personhood, in fact promotes a complex ecological ethics. Fetishism. Totemism. In many animistic worldviews, the human being is often regarded as on a roughly equal footing with other animals, plants, and natural forces. Shamanism. A shaman is a person regarded as having access to, and influence in, the world of benevolent and malevolent spirits, who typically enters into a trance state during a ritual, and practices divination and healing. Shamanism encompasses the premise that shamans are intermediaries or messengers between the human world and the spirit worlds. Shamans are said to treat ailments, illness by mending the soul, alleviating traumas affecting the soul. Spirit restores the physical body of the individual to balance and wholeness. The shaman also enters supernatural realms or dimensions to obtain solutions to problems afflicting the community. Shamans may visit other worlds, dimensions to bring guidance to misguided souls and to ameliorate illnesses of the human soul caused by foreign elements. The shaman operates primarily within the spiritual world, which in turn affects the human world. The restoration of balance results in the elimination of the ailment. Distinction from pantheism. Animism is not the same as pantheism, although the two are sometimes confused. Some religions are both pantheistic and animistic. One of the main differences is that while animists believe everything to be spiritual in nature, they do not necessarily see the spiritual nature of everything in existence as being united, the way pantheists do. As a result, animism puts more emphasis on the uniqueness of each individual soul. In pantheism, everything shares the same spiritual essence, rather than having distinct spirits or souls. Examples. Mun is the traditional polytheistic, animist, shamanistic, and syncretic religion of the Lepcha people. The New Age movement commonly demonstrates animistic traits in asserting the existence of nature spirits. Some neo-pagan groups, including eco-pagans, describe themselves as animists, meaning that they respect the diverse community of living beings and spirits with whom humans share the world, cosmos.